Hello, my name is Nadine Bartlett and I'm an assistant professor of inclusive education at the University of Manitoba. And on behalf of myself and my research assistant, Rebecca Herringer, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share some of our research at your annual conference. Before I begin our presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to talk about our study that we recently completed here in Canada, and it relates to the impact of COVID-19 school closures on children and youth with disabilities and their families. So in Canada, much like elsewhere in the world, in March of 2020, classes in Canadian schools were suspended in an effort to contain the spread of the coronavirus, and online or distance learning began. While some students experienced success in a virtual learning environment, many students who are vulnerable, in particular those with special education needs, were adversely affected by the movement to online learning because they had a corresponding reduction in academic, social, emotional, and therapeutic support. In Canada and elsewhere, it's important to explore the impact of COVID-19 and school closures on students with special education needs and their parents, because it's important to identify the facilitators and barriers to the support that they received. And as we enter a second wave of the global pandemic and the potential for school closures continues to exist, it's important to create accountability and oversight regarding the education of students with special education needs. The theoretical framework that we employed for our research was a human rights-based approach to disability. We argued that the adverse effects of COVID-19 have disproportionately affected children and youth with special education needs and their caregivers. As emphasized by UNESCO, persons with disabilities continue to remain a commonly invisible or left behind population during interventions. And this is true for most humanitarian crises and responses. Since students with special education needs typically receive support from a broad range of service providers, speech therapy, occupational therapy, one-on-one teaching from educational assistants, they were significantly affected when schools closed and many of these supports were no longer provided. In the absence of much needed supports, the responsibility for highly individualized instruction and specialized supports were disproportionately placed with two groups. First, with teachers, who often report they don't feel equipped or properly trained to support the complex needs of students with special educational needs in a virtual environment. And secondly, with parents, who may report feeling ill-equipped to address their child's needs and balance additional life demands. In terms of the methodology we employed, we used a mixed methods approach that involved an anonymous online survey, and we had about 250 parents or guardians of children and youth with special education needs respond to the survey that we distributed. The research questions we wanted answered were: how were school closures impacting children and youth with special education needs, and how are they impacting their caregivers? We wanted to know what kinds of supports were being provided, what parents thought were effective and helpful, and also what were the barriers that they were facing. Finally, we asked them for recommendations. What do they think they would need going forward in the global pandemic? In terms of the responses that we received from parents and guardians across Canada, majority of our respondents, well, 33%, were from Ontario, which is the most populous province in Canada, And the second highest rate of response we received was from the province of Manitoba, which is actually where our university is based. And then we received, next would be 14% of our respondents were from the province of British Columbia. And then we received smaller levels of responses from other provinces. And so in terms of our findings, there were some key themes that stood out that were important to us. One of the main themes that stood out was that parents reported that their child received very little direct teacher contact time. And by direct teacher contact time, we meant direct instruction in an online modality. And we found that interesting because in Canada, education is a provincial responsibility. And every province is responsible for education legislation and deciding on approaches to education. And the provinces had very different messages on how much contact teachers should actually have with students. Many didn't require contact time at all. Instead, they required hours of work that the students would engage in, which meant in some provinces, teachers could simply email or send work, but didn't actually have to participate in any kind of real-time instruction. And so parents reported that that was highly problematic in terms of meeting the needs of their children. So really almost half, so 48.56%, said that their child was not receiving any kind of teacher instruction. And then we received a number of parents who commented that their child would receive 1 hour a week. So that just goes to show that the instruction that students were receiving was very limited in most cases. So you can see from our graph here in terms of contact time that almost half were receiving 0 or none. And then because we asked how many minutes per day children and youth were receiving, we had a number of respondents select other because they provided, rather than information related to daily instruction, they provided information such as my child is receiving support once a week or once every 2 weeks. And that wasn't an option within the structure of our question. So that was also very interesting data for us. And because the population that we were most interested in learning about were students with special education needs, we wanted to know how their individualized education plans were being implemented in a home environment. And so we asked the question, was your child's individualized education plan adjusted for home instruction? And over 66% said no, that the individualized education plan that had been in place at school had not been adapted for home purposes or for home use. Another key piece that we inquired about related to individualized education plans was related to whether or not they had been evaluated, if indeed they had been used at home. So we asked parents if they did have an IEP developed for home, had it been evaluated? And 80%, just over 80%, indicated that if there had been an IEP, it was not evaluated at all. And so we know with individualized education plans, they need to be regularly evaluated so that goals are revisited and new goals are identified as children and youth progress. And so the fact that individualized education plans were not evaluated, we saw as highly problematic. In terms of the needs of the children and youth in our survey, we asked parents if their child had a diagnosis to identify what their special education need was. The majority of respondents indicated that almost half that their child had a learning disability. 38% indicated that their child had autism spectrum disorder, followed by attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and intellectual disability. But you can see from the graph here that we certainly had respondents indicate that their child had other forms of disability as well. We know that children and youth with special education needs receive support from a very diverse team, often involving multiple services. And certainly in Canada, we have many speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, psychologists, and social workers that provide service directly in our schools. And so we wanted to know how those supports were being offered once we moved to a remote learning environment. And so 80% of our respondents indicated that their child was not receiving any remote support from these other disciplines or clinical supports. And many characterize these kinds of supports as really vital to their child's programming. And so this too was something that was concerning to us. I should point out, though, that we did have some parents identify some highly creative clinical supports that were being provided in a remote way. For example, one student who had a physical disability and required an adapted bike in order to receive the exercise program that they needed. A physiotherapist came to the driveway at the home of that particular child and fitted a bike for them. So we did see some highly creative ways that clinical services were being deployed. But unfortunately, those creative attempts for service provision were more the exception than the rule. And so we also asked parents what the impact of school closure had been on their child. And not surprisingly, a majority of parents responded that their child had experienced a decline in academic learning. They had also experienced a decline in social skills, increased social isolation, not surprisingly, but also an increase in what they described as behavior challenges that were very difficult for them as parents to cope with. And so really there was a broad range of areas that parents reported that their child had experienced challenges. Parents were also asked to describe their child's profile of need. So we wanted to look at, what areas did the children and youth require very specific support. Not surprisingly, a majority responded they needed direct support in academic learning. But other areas were also highlighted: social inclusion, self-care, communication, behavior, and mental health stood out as some of the key areas that parents indicated their child required really individualized kinds of supports. From parents, what had been most effective in terms of the support that their child had received? And what parents reported was that real-time online direct instruction from the teacher was one of the most effective supports. But just going back to our previous findings, we know that that was also one of the most limited supports. They further reported that the opportunity to engage with. We also asked parents what they believed to be the most effective support for themselves when they were trying to support their child with at-home online learning. And they too reported that when the teacher was available for real-time direct instruction, that was most helpful to them as a parent. The second highest response rate was related to technology support. So having that sort of guidance from the school about how to use some technologies that were new to them was also highly appreciated and valued by the teachers in our survey. So overall, our findings in terms of children's needs were that parents reported by and large that they were not being adequately met in a remote or distance environment, that their child really missed that face-to-face and kind of hands-on learning, knowing that someone in the school system was available, reaching out and demonstrating care for them, but particularly that direct contact time with teachers, that one-on-one instruction was really lacking. As well as they asked for more adapted materials. So they wanted materials that didn't necessarily rely on the computer, but materials that they could actually engage their child in, that were related to learning and their specific IEP goals. And further to that, some modeling and mentorship about how to use those particular tools were identified as areas that would have been helpful, but were not received to the level that parents desired. So in terms of our thematic analysis of the most significant unmet needs during the school closures, in terms of our student population, you can see that words like, support and work, meaning direct online work, support from the teacher, teaching, social interaction, mental health came up very frequently as well, and opportunities for socialization were some of the other key themes that were identified. In terms of some quotations from our study that parents shared in terms of support being provided by the province that they lived in, some said they felt like they were forgotten. There was no documentation from the province in terms of information on websites that recognized students with special needs. A parent said, I only found special needs mentioned once in all the provincial documents, and this is again related to school closures. There's been no mention of how returning to school might look for students with special needs. So they felt there was a real gap in terms of communication from their respective province. Relatedly, when we asked parents and guardians what were some of their needs during this time, many said that they lacked communication with the school, like direct communication, and specific help and guidance, having no direct contact with the teachers often, really feeling very isolated in trying to address their child's needs. They said that schools were assuming that they were capable of teaching their children at home, and they really felt sort of left to their own devices in many regards. And while many parents reported that they had sufficient technology resources, what they said they lacked was technical support, that sort of direct kind of hands-on kind of direction in using technology that they had hoped the school would have provided. Not surprisingly, parents also reported that their mental health was suffering during this time and that they really felt overwhelmed. And a quote from a parent here is, assuming we can and have time and ability to teach, work, parent, and attempt to care for my own needs have been severely neglected. The pressure to keep up with everything is unreal. And the perception was that they weren't sort of being cared about. So parents felt very much on their own and very isolated during this time. And so in terms of some of our thematic findings when looking at the comments that parents made, you can see in the center there that respite was a theme that stood out. The parents really felt that they had once relied on respite care for them to have a little bit of a break and have direct support in their home. And since it stopped during the school closure time, they reported that as a significant barrier. And in terms of, you see just the word support standing out as well, just any kind of support, and that opportunity for them to learn how to use some of the remote or distance technology would also have been highly valued by the parents. And here's a quotation to illustrate that need for respite. So we asked parents what was the need, and this parent responded, respite. I have no respite whatsoever from 100% caregiving for my 3 children under the age of 10, the 5-year-old with Down syndrome. It has been very difficult to maintain sanity, quite literally. So you just see that the stress level for parents caregiving for students with really complex needs was overwhelming. So in summary of our findings, we found that children received minimal direct instructional time from teachers. That was a consistent theme across all provinces. Vital clinical supports were also almost non-existent. We had a few examples of really creative deploying of clinical services, but overall they were limited to non-existent. And individualized education plans had not been developed for the home. And if they had been developed, they hadn't been evaluated. So in terms of our recommendations based on our study, we really felt that minimum standards of direct contact time with students needed to be established by the provincial educational authorities. They varied so much across the country, with parents reporting, almost half of parents reporting that their child received no direct contact. We clearly thought there was a role for government to play in establishing minimum standards regarding contact time. We also heard from parents that maintaining clinical supports was also essential, and that again, because most clinical supports stopped, parents really reported that they needed, even through distance or remote means, they needed the schools to find a way to maintain those kinds of vital clinical supports. And so going forward, as we're in this second wave, these are things that really need to be considered and maintained. Our third recommendation is to ensure that individualized education programs or plans are developed for the home environment. That when remote learning resumes, that those plans need to be deployed and developed for home use. And further, they need to be monitored. So the regular monitoring that's expected in schools must continue in the home setting as well. Otherwise, we're going to see, and parents express concern over really significant regression in their child's progress. And another key theme, and it related to the theme of respite and additional support, was the need to maintain educational assistance supports. When schools closed in Canada, many school divisions laid off educational assistants, and so they were no longer part of the support team. And what we know for students with special education needs, that educational assistants play a vital role in the provision of that direct one-on-one support. And so because they were laid off, that was reduced what could have been another point of contact for students and their families. So when parents reported limited to no one-on-one support, we clearly see that educational assistants, while not the primary instructors, could have played a role in enhancing and increasing that kind of really important support. Thank you for the opportunity to share the results of our study. And our goal with this research was to tell the story of parents of children and youth with disabilities in Canada, and to make recommendations going forward to ensure that their right to an education is not adversely affected by the pandemic. And so we're sharing our results more broadly with the goal of achieving those objectives. My contact information is on the screen by email. If you have any questions and you'd like to discuss the research further, I would appreciate chatting with you. Thank you.